Effectively securing your organization and its reputation requires a smarter approach. To maximize efficiency and minimize risk, security experts turn to Logarithm, the only leading solution built solely for security teams by a security team committed to your success. With next-gen SIEM, user and entity behavior analytics, network traffic and behavior analysis, security automation and orchestration, and compliance, Logarithm provides security made smarter. Let the team at Black Hills Information Security test your defenses. With over 10 years of experience in penetration testing, red teaming, and threat hunting, the testers at Black Hills will help you find the holes in your security before the bad guys do. The team at Black Hills cares about educating and sharing their knowledge by creating countless blogs, open source tools, and webcasts for you to learn more about the tradecraft of pen testing and red teaming. Visit securityweekly.com/BHIS to join their mailing list and view the latest blogs and webcasts from Black Hills Information Security. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is unprotected attack paths that allow threats to compromise vulnerable targets in the cloud and data center. But traditional microsegmentation is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach. Edgewise Zero Trust Auto-Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation, delivering results immediately with a security outcome that's provable and management that's zero-touch. Driven by machine learning, Edgewise automatically builds policies that protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network. They provide measurable improvement by quantifying attack path risk reduction and verifying software identity before it communicates to stop application compromises and data breaches. To see how to eliminate your network attack surface, visit securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Paul, will be providing his insights, that's what the teleprompter says, and predictions in the information and cybersecurity space at the local ISC Squared Rhode Island chapter meeting this Monday, coming Monday, November 18th at Greg's Restaurant in Providence. Doug, you going to be there? Should be there.
Actually, no, I have class that night. So.
Oh. Can't you get like a grad student? Anyway, if you would like to join us, go to securityweekly.com/ISC2RI. That's, oh, look at that. It's a map of Rhode Island and everything.
Yay.
Yeah. It's because it fits on the screen.
Yeah.
Anywho, I hope to see everyone there Monday night. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, you should come. I mean, ISC Squared is a good organization in Rhode Island.
I like presenting to local events.
Yeah. It's had a lot of growth in that. It's just been there for like a year or less.
Yeah, because there's ISSA, there's ISACA, and then there's Patrick Laverty's, which is like the rest of the the groups in Rhode Island. So.
But the ISC Square one, I think, is kind of new.
Yeah, it's good. Good stuff. Alrighty, gentlemen, are we ready to tackle the story? Where did you want to start for the stories of this week?
At yours, because you got the most.
All right, let's start at the top.
I think we got to talk about McDonald's.
I wanted to start because, Doug, you said you attended a meeting. Mitre Foundation aims at boosting critical infrastructure. They've announced the launch of a tech foundation focused on strengthening critical infrastructure through partnerships with the private sector. And by partnerships, they mean people that pay them to be part of the thing?
They're like asking large companies to join Mitre, and I guess the deal is they give you access to findings and reports a little sooner than the general public gets. I mean, they're still a nonprofit, so but they're asking people
they have to monetize somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think
they get levels of funding, right? But
right.
Mitre's done. And say what you will about that. We're just trying to lay it all out for our audience, right? Mitre's doing great work.
They are.
They always have.
They do tons of stuff. They produce massive numbers of reports. I mean, they have a huge organization. They have thousands of people working on these problems. And it was mostly government funded, initially, and they have a huge center. But they're always doing cool stuff, and it's interesting to keep up with what they're doing. And if I could afford it, I'd be a partner. But
the Center for Threat-Informed Defense is a privately funded research and development organization, conducts applied research and advanced development in an attempt to advance cyber defense at scale worldwide.
Yeah, so they're continuing to produce stuff, like Attack and Caldera and things like that.
And CVE is one of the things that comes out of Mitre, of course, right? Yeah.
Give people insight, and I don't know if they're going to do like custom tests and things, but they may well for partners and and whatever. But like Bryson was saying on the earlier segment, they will put together like attack matrices for you and things like that. So I'm presuming all that's sort of embedded in this new initiative that they're trying to do going forward. They're just trying to create a monetized, stable, permanent operation, because government funding is always going to be fleeting. I mean, it's it's the idea of the government funding of anything was to get it started. It's like seed money, and you're supposed to figure out how to monetize it, because if you can't, it probably shouldn't persist. I mean,
that's a good point.
Have to be propped up permanently, then maybe you're not valid. So
you're not providing enough value. Eventually, you're going to be funded to create value that the private sector is going to pay for that. And I think Mitre has reached that point.
They have. I mean, everybody loves free stuff, but I mean, at some point they have to sort of leave the nest and become like an entity, and that will make them stronger if they
Agreed.
I think they've reached that point as well. I mean, and good for them, right? I mean, it's some of the quality material they're putting out is just amazing. So, I'm all for it.
Yep. I think it's a great idea, and I think that's how they move forward and become a permanent kind of component of it.
And help companies that detect breaches after years, or only after the hacker, and I hate the way the media uses that term today, but I think we're stuck with it. The hacker maxed out the server storage. My comment was they need better visibility into their indicators of compromise, as disk space too low is kind of a slow way of an indicator of compromise.
I think the horse is already bolted.
They discovered the breach on March 7th, 2016, when they began receiving alerts that one of its servers had reached its maximum capacity, which was due to a massive data archive file that the hacker created on its customers. And I laugh, but this actually is part of a data breach now. Surprisingly, the intruder managed to breach the company at least 2 more times, even after InfoTrack Systems, which is the company that was breached, became aware of the intrusion.
I mean, you have to understand that a lot of I did a case like this years and years ago, like maybe in like 2002 or something, and they had this very similar problem. They weren't stealing data. They were using the company's systems to store porn. It was part of this thing.
That was common back then.
It was called Pornster. Yeah, and so it was just somebody had cracked in. But, I mean, a lot of companies have capabilities, but they don't have any kind of security organizations at all. And they may have somebody who can keep the system running. Like the one I did was like that. They had a database person, and he was good at database. He didn't know anything about security, and he was just an engineer type person, and he knew how to set up the database. And he called the police, who didn't know what to do, who called me, because they were saying, we don't understand why the drives keep filling up. And he didn't really know enough about all that stuff to understand what was going on. And then he said, I tried to stop these people from logging in, and then they just log in again. And they didn't have any security organization at all, or any idea how to contact one. So you still see that. I mean, you see that all the time with companies, even mid-size and sometimes bigger companies. They have an IT infrastructure, they have a data infrastructure, but they don't have a security organization. And, the security organization is some guy named Chet down in marketing who, got stuck with that job because they didn't know what else to do. So they named him that for the audit.
Hold on. Isn't Chet the brother in Weird Science?
Weird Science?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, you guys actually reminded me of something that I do as a pen tester actively, and you're probably going to laugh a little, but it's actually not funny. There's a tool called NTDS Util that you can use to extract a copy of the Active Directory database if you're interested in pulling that data offline. Well, Active Directory databases tend to be fairly large, right?
Yep.
I mean, they're sizable. And so I actually literally, and I think this is actually good practice, I check how much disk space is available on the domain controller before I hit that, because if I hit that and I exhaust the disk,
you're caught.
They're gonna catch me.
Yep. Well, maybe. Maybe they're just going, I don't know, our drives are all full. Empty your recycle bin.
Yeah, well, maybe, but I kind of assumed that they will. So I actually always have this habit of going, wait a minute, this AD database might be pretty big. Let me check how much disk space, because some people are pretty tight on their disk space. They allocate, right, if these things are VMs or sitting out in the cloud somewhere. So I'm like, let me check first before I do this.
And a domain controller doesn't, in your case, Joe, right, doesn't need a whole ton of disk space. If it's storing logs,
no, it really doesn't, right?
Right? It's not a data storage kind of thing. Like, you're storing the user file.
It is. You got to remember that ntds.det is actually a database file that can grow pretty large and pretty sizable.
If you have a lot of users, but then. It's,
when you're using NTDS util, what you're doing is creating a replica copy on the disk.
So you're doubling. I mean, you're doubling the largest file on the system, right? Yeah.
So.
And a lot of times they run that file is running on the local disk rather than like on a RAID or a NAS. So they often have a lot less disk space on that disk. They want the fastest disk they got, so they're running on that local system disk, and that'll be the smallest disk out there.
Right.
Right. And now the alternative is of throwing in some pen testing here is if they have a recent volume shadow copy, then just go ahead and take the SAM system and ntds.dit right off this volume shadow copy, and don't worry about it.
All this loops around to you ought to understand the baseline of your environment. I mean, if you're a security operative, you ought to understand what your network looks like, and you ought to know, wow, look at this file, it just doubled in size. Something's going on. When you don't have those people or they don't know what they're doing, then Joff doubles your file size and you go, I don't know, the disk is full, we'll order a new one, or we'll put it in next year's budget. In the meantime, empty your recycle bins. I mean, I've literally seen stuff like that. And they don't even investigate it.
So a couple comments after Lee. Yeah, go, you first, Lee.
I was going to just jump on to what Doug was saying, and that based on what they got, they clearly didn't know it was on the system.
Yep.
And I was expecting you to jump in on the part where they're talking about they harvested 2,300 full credit cards, names, CCV numbers, addresses. It's like, what the hell were they thinking? Why isn't that stuff still there? And they probably didn't know it was there. If they didn't know the disk was full.
Yeah, they didn't know it was there.
Well, so a couple comments. My first comment is, the article is like, this is the latest example, and yet it's an article talking about something that happened over 3.5 years ago. What made it reportable was they've reached a settlement with the FTC. And the FTC settlement is something I'm familiar with because of my years being the QSA at the TJX companies. From what I can tell, and I clicked through and I was reading through the settlement, I don't see that they're getting any kind of fines. It doesn't mean that they haven't paid fines already and weren't sued by customers and stuff like that. But they're getting off kind of easy in terms of the volume of credit cards. Again, I'm on this theme of compliance. Why is that? Oh, I've got a Security and Compliance Weekly show now. Yes, they all need to do the things that Doug described, but companies don't do that unless they have to. And in this company, if all they had was PCI data, credit card data, and what was stolen, which should have been everything, but it was only a few thousand, it means they were a small merchant. It means they didn't have a third-party assessor coming in and evaluating their security program. They were self-assessing. So, this is a very common instance for a lot of small companies. There's a lot of things that they should be doing, but security isn't telling them to do that because there isn't security there. There's an IT department, and somebody every once in a while puts on the hat of security when they have to go, jumpstart the firewall or something like that.
Well, I completely agree with Jeff about that, but the problem is I don't know how that legislation gets passed, because every time they bring this up, these same companies are screaming bloody murder because they say if you do this, it'll bankrupt us. You're going to require us. It's just like Sarbanes and HIPAA and everything else. There's a lot of pushback against that kind of legislation, and especially small and medium-sized businesses start saying we're going to hire how many people in order to do this. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I want it.
But a lot of times that doesn't matter, whether it's the government or a big company that's putting other companies out of business, Doug. And so I'll give you two examples. One, in the state of Rhode Island, right? The recent, would you call it temporary legislation they were able to pass against the fruit-flavored vape.
Oh, yeah.
And it was appealed. They brought it to a judge, actually, the vaping companies, and said it was impacting our business. And the judge upheld the Rhode Island law, temporary, I don't know if you call it a law, but
it was an executive order by the governor.
An executive order by the governor. And they upheld that, even though the evidence that they had to support that executive order was completely unfounded, and they were in the way wrong direction. Yeah. We found out later, right? And some speculate that they knew that beforehand, but we'll get into that on Politics Security Weekly.
Coming soon.
We're coming soon to a show. But the other example ties into another story with YouTube, where personal experience, we've experienced this at Security Weekly on numerous fronts with multiple big, the big companies. Apple, fortunately, podcasts, cool, for the most part, cool, though I think you really got to be a controversial, I don't know, you got to be way out there for Apple to yank your podcast, all right? And that's happened, certainly, but it's few and far between, right? Facebook has guidelines that they've enforced that we've had to work, specifically with the cigar and tobacco thing. Even though we don't sell tobacco, we're just doing a podcast on cigars. We're limited, can't do certain things, and then it's not even worth it to use Facebook at a certain point. Then you go to YouTube, and you look at our experiences with simple things like legitimately applying for more quota on YouTube, and the process being very undefined and very arbitrary, where they can, basically if they feel like it or not, be like, you know what, you get more quota, and you know what, you don't. And it's not like in Rhode Island where you can, slip someone an envelope full of money and get a license for something or more quota, right?
I swear that never happens.
That never happens, right? But there's big companies like that doesn't happen, so you're left with no recourse. We've had our channels disabled temporarily multiple times from YouTube back in the day. And then there's this whole thing that's happening now that some of the I think this article is wrong. I don't know where does this come from. Sophos Naked Security is saying no, YouTube isn't planning to jettison your unprofitable channel, which I think is all right. So I don't have evidence that based on the profitability of a channel, YouTube has said we're banning you from the platform, okay? I don't have that evidence. However, when I look at the changes they've made to their terms of service, it's pretty clear that they want the least specific language possible to say your channel's gone. Yeah, now, I'd argue they had that before.
It just says
right?
it's no longer commercially viable, and I mean...
What does that mean?
It doesn't mean anything. It means they can use any metric they want to use, and they can say, this didn't sell ads, this took up too much disk space, this had too many downloads. They can use it any way they want.
Any way they want.
I mean, it's their company, though. I mean, you have to remember, it's not a public service. It's not the public library. YouTube is a private company. They make money.
But let's go back to your example with legislation. If my company's income is based on my YouTube channel, which, again, not a great business model, just throwing that out there, but there are lots of people who have made a living on YouTube ads and promoting their channel.
I gave one $10 out there in the parking lot on the way
in. For better or for worse.
We'll podcast for food.
YouTube, they're not a government entity, right? But they're the provider. They can basically arbitrarily say, yeah, you know what, you're done.
Yeah.
And based on absolutely nothing. And that's kind of scary.
But they've always been able to do that. They can change these rules anytime they want. There's no law says they can't pass a policy and say now only channels that support the current administration can be aired. I mean, they can do whatever they want.
And that's scary. To me, that's scarier than government legislation and regulations that don't make any sense, right? Is that now these
already?
It is happening already, Tyler. You're absolutely. I mean, going back to my cigar example with Facebook, they've taken a stance on tobacco. We're not violating any laws, right?
Nope.
And we're even willing to say, look, you got to check a box. If we're going to send you samples, you have to, show proof of age in not just your state, not just your city, but your town, that you're of legal smoking age, and we'll send you a free sample. We'll go by the law to the letter. That doesn't matter. Facebook has come up with a policy that says these are the confines you must work in if we think your content is of a certain type. They can change that policy
tomorrow.
And then they can change that policy tomorrow.
They can say, you can't have cat memes because Zuck doesn't like it, and it's a policy and tough. And if you don't want to do it, you can use some other platform. And so that's what YouTube's doing, and they're saying you don't like. And it's like basically then they give this marketing release of we made some changes to make things easier for you and to make sure you understand our very nebulous legalese. And this makes it simple for you. And if you have any questions, just don't call. Thanks.
Well,
call 1-800-I-CARE.
Yeah. But I think a lot of this is in response to government legislation on YouTube for the way they treat channels that are geared towards children or not. They were in violation of COPA,
Yeah.
And have actually every single YouTube channel now, you have to go in and select that either my channel or I'm going to go video by video. This content is appropriate for children or it's not. And from what I found, that language is very, very clear, largely because there's government scrutiny now on YouTube.
Well, that's what they're afraid of, though, because if you go back to like the utility wars and the phone company wars, what happened was the government was starting to look at phone companies and go, we want you to do this. And the phone companies said, bite me. You know, we're the phone company. We'll do whatever the hell we want. You know, and the government said, okay, we're going to break you up. We're not going to let you. You're a monopoly. And so if it becomes a case where somebody can claim YouTube as a monopoly, then people can start suing them and saying there is no competition. I don't have a way to make a living outside of YouTube, and there's no other option.
We're just going to host our videos on Pornhub.
Yeah, but then the government gets involved, and then you are well and truly screwed because then they step in and regulate you, like, you know, with their thumb on it and go, you know, the new Department of Video Content will be deciding what you see and what you don't see, and good luck with that.
Sorry, comments?
I don't think customers or even companies being told what to do, right, for whether it be compliance or regulation. At the end of the day, the company's there to make money. That's what we're all there to do. And so it has to directly affect their bottom line in some way. And I think we have to get away from this forcing, you know, the government tries to force us all to do things that we don't like. We don't like to pay taxes, and we still kind of do. However, it doesn't incentivize that. I think
Wait, what do you mean kind of do? I mean...
Oops.
We'll talk after the show, Tyler.
we do, and trust me, I pay a fuck ton of them.
But
I paid my taxes kind of because I use monopoly money.
That's true. That's true. So to incentivize that, though, you really need something like, I think, almost like we have with consumers, right? Like the companies themselves are leveraging our credit score and our reliability as far as an individual. Well, from a consumer standpoint, we need to get to the point where we're holding these companies liable and we're giving them a credit rating. Similar to like you go to a restaurant and you have an A or B plus, that determines whether or not you want to go eat there, right? So having that security metric or that grading of these companies and how they do security and how they handle data, how they look at our privacy, I think once we get to that point and consumers are informed enough to look at these metrics and use that and make an educated guess, I think that's when it's going to start changing a little bit.
Right. You know, the only way to get a security rating is to have a compliance program.
That may be the first step.
But that's assuming that we have a choice. If you're going to host content that is of a type of video, you're going to put it on YouTube. I mean, where else are you going to put it where it's going to get views, right? That's back to Doug's point of the monopoly.
Then it's a monopoly, and then the government can theoretically get involved in that under antitrust law that exists and say this is the only...
Which Bill Gates says the antitrust legislation against Microsoft, I don't know if I covered this story. I want to hear your, since you mentioned antitrust, was the reason that he was and others at Microsoft so distracted that they lost in the mobile marketplace. And if it wasn't for antitrust, we'd all be running Windows phones instead of Android.
Well, that's what he says. And I mean, every company I've ever dealt with hates antitrust laws because everybody wants to be a monopoly.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, if you go back to Tyler's point, if your goal is to make money, you want to be a monopoly.
And I mean, if Bill Gates can get his hands on every single thing, you bet we'd be running Microsoft phones because we wouldn't have a choice. It'd be like, yes, you will run this, or you won't. You have to set up your own cellular network because it's the only thing supported. So that's why antitrust laws exist.
There'd be a line item on your cell phone bill, and it would be a license fee for Windows Mobile.
And it would be all Microsoft products, and you'd be using Outlook, and you'd be using, Gates app and GateTube and
GateTube.
Yeah.
Wow.
That went in
capitalism, though, right? Like,
that is capitalism. If you got the best mousetrap, you catch all the
comments were classic. That was awesome. All right, I want to talk about. Go ahead, Jeff.
My story number 2 are friends at Coalfire that got arrested. Apparently, they're still facing criminal charges.
Are you serious?
Yep.
You're gonna bring this one up?
Oh, I mean that's just an injustice of our justice system, in my opinion. No, all right. Someone else.
100%.
Okay.
Like this is gonna have a lot of people upset though watching this video.
Because we've always said, and at least I've always said, I don't want to speak for everyone else, but I've always said the difference when we teach those coming up in our field, when we teach students like Doug and others, right? The difference between ethical hacker, not ethical hacker, the difference between being a criminal and being a good hacker, right, is permission. And you have to show permission. If you have permission, you're helping that company be more secure. I've always said, even in the context of working within your own company, right? There was the Pearl guy was one of the first cases, right, where internally, I forget his name. It'll come to me. Someone else will think of it. But have permission, whether you're working for that company, whether you're contracting for that company, you've got permission. We call it your permission slip, like we used to in grade school to go to the bathroom, right? It's your permission slip. That's what separates you from legal action and violating the law and helping that company under a contract. How is there gray area in this, right? Permission or not?
That's the problem. Like I've used to work in a lot of state and local government, and I've worked with tons of sheriffs, former and present, and the election and the politics that happen with inside of state and county government and the battles, like this is actually a fairly small battle. This is a political thing that just happened to hit news and highlights. This happens all the time. And so really there's zero, from what I can see, and I'm no lawyer, but we do have an article coming out where we've evaluated the law around this, and a bunch of lawyers have looked at it. And it's pretty cut and dry. There's a contract with inside of what they were doing, that everything was T was crossed, the I was dotted. This is 100% political waves to bring up something where someone's feelings got hurt. And it's going to affect all of us, though. And we're already hearing about companies that are wanting to take physical off of the table and not look at that as a vector of attack.
You know what this reminds me of, Tyler? You ever see the movie Porky's?
Oh, God.
Right? Where he's like, you got a broken headlight, right? And then he smashes the headlight. This is what we're dealing with right now.
That was 100%. That's, I mean, you got to think of it in that context. And if people would understand the dynamics of politics within inside of state and local governments, especially sheriffs in a courthouse.
And this has always been a razor's edge. I mean, if you go back into the 80s, you saw people breaking into things and then reporting it to the company. And initially that was sort of cool. And you call them and say, I got into your system through this dial-up modem or whatever. And they go, wow, okay, great. Well, look at that. And all of a sudden, people were calling them, and they're going, yeah, we're calling the police, and you're going to be in jail for exploiting this, even though you didn't do anything. Today, I think there's a lot of sort of politics around it. If constituents are calling in and complaining, or big businesses are calling in to the sheriff and complaining and saying, this has got to stop, and that person, wants to keep getting campaign donations and whatever.
But it's astounding to us because as hackers, right, and we've worked in information security and done pen tests, this is a precedent that we've set within our community. Maybe this is the opportunity to vocalize this and disseminate it outside of our smaller community, right? Because we had, what was Nickerson's show that they did where they stole a car, right? Tiger Team. They legit stole a car, right? No one got arrested. And that was years ago. We've set the precedent that we can do things in an ethical manner to help the businesses be more secure. And how did this go awry where people aren't latching on the idea that, yes, people with permission can do this?
Let me compare it to forensics. So there was this whole controversy about forensics quite a while ago, where certain states started saying, if you do forensics, you have to have a PI license.
Yes. And in Rhode Island, to get your PI license, you have to do an apprenticeship.
No.
It used to be you had
I have a PI license in Rhode Island.
Because you got an envelope full of money and you...
No,
Rhode Island decide.
I took no. I swear it didn't happen that way. It wasn't an envelope.
It was a check.
It was Bitcoin.
Yeah, it was Bitcoin.
It's a really big check.
But no, it was. But that thing came about, and all of a sudden they were saying you're going to be arrested.
Right.
So I actually went to a meeting in North Carolina, and I went to a meeting in Massachusetts, and I went to a meeting in Texas, with these PI boards, and these PI boards were controlled by local politicians whose brother-in-law was the head of the PI committee. And this guy in North Carolina just looked me right in the eye and he said, "You come down here and do that stuff, son, you're going to jail." And I was like, "Why?" I mean, because I'm doing something legal to support a lawsuit. And he goes, "I don't care." He was like, "You come down here and do that, you're going to prison." And I was like, and I mean, so there's a lot of this stuff is like, one, misinformation. So they were hackers. All general constituents here is hackers. They don't know what that means. They don't know what's going on. And somebody calls a local politician and says, "Hey, I want these guys in jail, and I want them in jail today." And they go out and arrest them, and they charge them with, crimes against nature or whatever. And your headlights busted. Okay, you're going to jail. And those things vary so wildly from one place to another and from time to time. A lot of it's misinformation. They'll probably beat this charge in court. I'm no lawyer either, and I haven't studied this case. But, I mean, a lot of these things are just, it got a big headline, and it'll go. But it is dangerous because if suddenly states go, "Wow, pen testing's a violation of all that's holy," and they say everybody's going to jail that does pen tests, and you have to have special licensing, and you have to have a PI license. They talked about that for pen testers too. You got to have a PI license or be being supervised by a PI at all times. So if I went and did a forensics case in Massachusetts, even though I had a PI license in Rhode Island, I had to hire a local PI at great expense to go sit at a diner while I did my forensics case. And then he'd go, "You done yet?" And I'm like, "Not yet." And he's like, "Call me when you're finished." So, I mean, all this is just, a lot of it is the legal side of the world trying to catch up with the tech side. We understand this stuff, but a lot of times people don't. Local politicians have no idea what this means, and they get some guy that gets all incensed about it, and they call in and get all worried, and they say, "We're going to do something about it."
But Doug, in this particular instance, and this article doesn't have a lot of detail. There were several other articles that came out today. This isn't a technology test. This was the physical security test.
Understand.
From what I can tell, there wasn't a clear understanding of rules of engagement, or there wasn't a clear understanding of, well, we hired a bunch of pen testers. What are they doing trying to break into the back door of whatever building it was that they got caught? So, yes, it's miscommunication, misunderstanding, and it's silly that they're still facing charges.
I completely
I can just imagine the politics.
I completely agree. I mean, and we always tell our students, look, you have got to have a scope document. You have to have a scoping document. If you start exceeding that, and for when I taught forensics all the time, you had to have a scope document. You needed to have an attorney reviewing those scoping documents. And if you're going to go out there and operate without a net, good luck, because I didn't want to do it.
That's the big problem with this, though, is they have all the documentation. There's a really clear understanding on scope. Everybody that was involved signed up all the way to the very top. The lawyers for both parties reviewed it, even at the state level, and so literally everything is covered here, even down to what tests they were going to be running against the bill.
Well, no, that's why I'm saying they're going to beat it. I mean, I don't think they're going to get.
I don't
convicted.
know. Like that's the problem is they've already dropped the charges once, and this is old. This has been going on.
No, I know, and I mean it makes their life suck, but I think in the end you probably win that case because you got all your ducks in a row. I mean, but I mean it doesn't mean things don't suck in the meantime, and you're sitting there in jail and you're not working, or you're sitting at home under indictment or whatever. So yeah, it sucks. But we've seen it over and over again in this field, and I mean, I saw it in forensics, and there were people being arrested, there were people being, having their business licenses revoked, and all kinds of stuff. Just, a lot of it was just politics and misinformation. So it's unfortunate.
It's a good platform and a good time. It's in the limelight to, I think, really get the appropriate message out there. People like Dave Kennedy are coming out and coming on news, dropping articles. The Coal Fire CEO has done some really good articles explaining a lot of it and being very forthcoming and political. So I think it's a good platform if it's used well and companies actually get the message out.
Yeah, I agree.
But, I mean, to Doug's point, at the extreme, it could mean that pen tests are not conducted in certain areas because they're just going to ignore all that.
Well, I mean, if some states say, if the state attorney, just like in forensics, if the Texas state attorney general says you can't do this, if you do it, you're going to jail, then, companies aren't going to do pen tests there because they're not going to send their people down there to get arrested. So,
and then they're going to get ransomware.
Yeah.
Because they're not, anyway, not that happened in Texas.
Let me throw out a devil's advocate question. Is a physical security test really necessary in our test? And Tyler and Joff weigh in because you guys are, the active pen testers in the group right now. But how necessary is the physical security aspect of what is supposed to be a technical cyber security penetration test exercise?
So I would take this in twofold, right? I'm actually on a physical right now, just getting back from multiple companies, Mexico, Paris, kind of doing these all over. One of the reasons that it is a viable and necessary test is companies need to understand even if they do have a fully hardened external, firewall, they've got good spear phishing, they've got good detection for initial access, and they have worldwide headquarters and threat profiles in, say, China or Hong Kong. These are things that an attacker is going to know, and they're going to be looking at. If they've sent a bunch of spearfish, well, many of them are not wanting to travel. A motivated adversary is going to pay off someone to go get in physically.
Yep.
And how do you test against that? How do you know if that's a physical vector? The second part to that is many of these companies don't have the full security maturity or understanding at the top levels or with the economic buyers. And so you have to get the impact and the buy-in and prove that, yes, someone can do it. Yes, you have, we weren't able to get all these fish in. We weren't able to get past your firewall. You don't have any vulnerabilities from outside, but we were able to get in through a physical means. And so without that physical access or that physical entry point, many of these companies are very difficult to get into. However, once you're in, and that could be physically, then it's a pretty soft interior, and they don't realize that threat and that actual risk. So you have to show them the risk, and how you show them is through one of the means, and physical is one of the necessary.
But I think the point to underscore there is not necessarily the attacker physically traveling, getting on an airplane or traveling in any means to go to a target, right?
Nope.
I was successful when I was doing pen tests where you evaluate your circumstances, right? It was an educational institution. We were pen testing. They wanted to see what their trust level was, what their security was physically. Happened to have a student intern working with me at the time. I'm like, you actually are a student, right? Here's the thumb drive. Go to all the sensitive areas of the organization and say you're from the help desk and say you got this USB to plug in. And so, like, the OPSEC and even the whole storyline that I was asking the person to do, a large percentage of the population could do, right? Like, you find someone that's a student or fits the profile, and here's your story. I'm from the help desk. I need 2 minutes on your computer. Person was like, yeah, no problem, right? Plugs the thumb drive in. I'm like, hey, just all you have to do is drag and drop that core impact agent onto the desktop, double click it, and you're done. And I'm good. I just need to drop this this valuation management software on your system. Gave them a couple of storylines if they asked questions, which largely weren't needed, and you're good, right? And so not only is that, again, to Tyler's point, proving a point to upper management as to how easy it is, it's an educational exercise for those working for the organization to, again, I come back to the narrative, everyone likes to trust and then verify. In that situation, you need to teach your employees not what to look for, not to profile the person, not to look at what they're carrying, but verify and then trust and be like, you know what, if someone comes in and says they're from IT, here's 3 people you call to verify, who that person. If it fails, you don't let them in and you call security.
It was our first whole tier in Sarbanes and HIPAA was doing physical pen tests because I was a huge advocate that if you get physical access, you own them. I mean, all this fancy stuff's great, but if the simplest path to victory is just to walk in the damn fire door at 3 o'clock in the morning and walk into the server room, which I did on multiple occasions. I mean,
it doesn't even need social engineering.
I didn't have to do shit. I just went around the back of the building.
You guys know that you physical pen or have done them in the past, right? All of us have done that, right?
I'll never forget. I got.
You just walk in,
story.
right?
Right. Clipboard and a cap.
I will never forget one organization I walked into, and I literally went to the bathroom, not because I was trying to hide out, because I needed to go to the bathroom. Okay.
Happens.
And there was a door in the bathroom, and I opened the door, and it was a network wiring closet.
So many of us have those stories, and they're not fables like the server in the wall at the university.
The real deal,
like these are real
right?
deals. Yeah.
Yeah. So all I did was pull up a chair that was in the closet and close the door and camped out for half a day. Right. I mean, it literally stuff like that happens. And physical, it turns out, is a relatively soft target with a low skill barrier to entry.
And let me tell you a story about that. Not a story, but so I was giving a presentation to a bunch of law enforcement people, and I was talking about how we carried all these tools with us because I was trying to convince them how important physical security was. And they were looking at the stuff I had, and one of the law enforcement people who was from New York said, if you bring that into New York, you're going to get arrested because you have lockpicks, a wrecking bar, and some other stuff there. And I said, well, couldn't this screwdriver be used as a burglary tool? And he goes, sure. And he goes, and I can arrest you for having it too. All I got to do is be able to convince somebody that you are going to use that for burglary. So, I mean, all this stuff is very squishy. And when I first moved to Rhode Island, I had lock picks. I had all kinds of stuff. I had a twister box. And my twister box was even, if it's illegal in the United States. I bought it in Hong Kong. And because it's a twister box you could use to jailbreak phones.
Oh, okay.
And it was illegal. And I had to go to the state police and tell them that I had these things because I didn't want to get police. Because he told me, he said, if you get pulled over and they search your car and you've got lock picks and other burglary tools, you can be charged with it. And it's like, yikes. And so same thing here. You start these guys, effectively a physical pen test could be considered a burglary. Although if there's no complainant, I'm not sure exactly how they charge you. But if there is a complainant, they can charge you with burglary. So
yeah, so it's a very, Doug's got a good point. It's a very squishy line. Coming full circle though, I have a lot of empathy for the coal fire guys because they did dot the I's and cross the T's. They did all the right things and they got trapped into a political shit show, which has got them in the position they're in. And yes, it sends shockwaves through the industry. Yes, it makes us think twice about engaging in these things because even if you do the right things all the way up the chain of command, you don't know if you're going to get into an interagency fight like that. You just have no idea.
And then you're sitting there trying to provide, counsel for yourself and everything else because you got a big problem. And right or wrong, you're caught in the middle of a war, and it's going to suck.
Yeah. The other thing I think to take the other side of this is there are times in which we do recommend not having a physical pen test, right? Like there are cases where it makes a lot more sense if the company understands and they have full buy-in and they're working down their maturity line and their security roadmap, and they're really just trying to get a good test and get good coverage and be comprehensive. We'll often work with them and just say, listen, like we could get in physically. You obviously know that.
Yeah.
Let's save your time, money, and budget and
Right.
put that towards, a better return on investment, which would be more coverage on an internal side.
Yeah,
or
and
covering-
Tyler,
Well, thank you, Tyler, because to me, that's probably 99.9% of the companies out there. I think there's very few companies that are mature enough. Out of all the companies in the world, there's very few companies that are mature enough to need that type of testing.
Well, I'm going to argue with Jeff on that because I won't say 99% because I agree with you in theory, Jeff, but we were actually auditing companies that had physical security organizations that were set up to try to prevent these things, and they needed to be tested because they had spent money on these things. And I agree with you. It often we can just say, sure, we'll get past them or somebody will pick a lock or whatever. But the idea that I could just literally stroll past a paid, trained security guard at 3 o'clock in the morning in a rental car was an important piece of information for that company to know, because then they were able to sit there.
You're bringing in an additional layer, though, and I would agree with you, especially when you have In the early days of this industry, there was a big debate on whether you should outsource or not. So the idea of a third party was anathema in the very beginning. And I always used to point to all these companies saying, well, we have a policy against not doing anything with a third party. I said, the guy at the front desk, does he work for you? No, he's a third party. Your physical security is a third party. So yeah, when it's a third party, absolutely, it's legitimate. Same argument for using a third-party managed security
and we did a quick assessment of it. So if we walked through and said you don't have any physical security, so just assume it's going to be compromised. So basically, all this is a waste of time. I mean, but I just wouldn't say it's 99% of the companies don't need that. I think that you need to look at your situation and say, can students just walk into my server room, or can I put up a metal door?
I'll debate percentage points, but in my experience, the vast majority of companies, I can't think of an example where there's one customer I've ever had where they were mature enough where they were really ready for a test, meaning it wasn't extremely easy. It wasn't very successful, whatever sometimes we didn't even try to do it and it just happened. Well, it wasn't our intent, and we just, Jeff.
Jeff, I just think your percentages are a little high. I don't know if I have data to back that up, but yeah, I think that one of the differentiators is if you do have security guards or not, right? Yeah. Or trained personnel, whether it's third party or internal, whose job it is to monitor and control physical access. If you have that, I think there needs to be some level of testing, especially if you have procedures in place, which I think is another variable. If you're taking sanction in security that, I have a physical person there who's monitoring and maintaining access, and therefore I don't need to test it, and maybe you haven't put process and procedures in place, maybe you're not ready for a test. Put some process and procedures in place first, then do your test. If you're just saying, look, I had this open position, I created this position, this person's job is to make sure people sign in, right? And that's the only process and procedure you have, Jeff, there's no need to test it, right? But if you've done some awareness and training and said these are the processes you follow, right? Then I think it's worthwhile for you to not just test the processes, but also test the people, and not all the people. Get the person who does a good job and have them do internal training.
And some of this is about degrees too. We didn't James Bond this stuff. It wasn't about like, oh yeah, can I hang from a wire crawling through a duct and and get in through the sewer tunnel? It was more like, can I walk past the front desk in the doctor's office and get into the file room?
Yeah.
And COBIT recommended those, and HIPAA recommended those, and and our opinion was we shouldn't be able to do this, and I want to prove to you that we can, because if you ask them, they'll always say, oh no, someone would stop you, and then I would literally go in the doctor's office and just go, I would walk in there with a clipboard and go, hi, we're inspecting the outlets, and they'd let me in.
And in healthcare,
it wasn't a massive expense for them where we were James Bonding it. It was just literally like, do you have even basic approaches to this?
But I think, but your industry also kind of determines, because healthcare and hospitality, there's the public is walking through.
But the law said they needed to have it, so we were cheating if they did. And
there's a couple things missing though that I think not everyone considers when doing physicals. You're not only there to test, like, say, third parties, right? Like, the third party thing is nice. You're testing that. But that also is a layer and defense in depth, right? If you're relying strictly on the third party and not looking at, okay, once they get past that, then what's our layer of defense? But then taking that a step further, when you're doing a physical, you're testing multiple avenues that a lot of people aren't considering. Is your USB ports locked down?
Yep.
Are you doing your vendor ID? If someone brings in an outside jump drive from their home, maybe they're not even doing a physical, they work for you. Is that something that is going to get exploited? Is someone running wire for a contracting company able to go over the false ceiling and get into the server room?
Yep.
That's a problem, right? So these are things that you're testing multiple layers of defense in depth.
And Tyler, what you're highlighting, though, is there's been a shift over the past 30 plus years, right, where in the past computers were housed in one location, and it was just inherent in the culture that if you shouldn't be there, then you're out, right? And I saw this in action, the culture in the university, right? That had many universities, right? Had some of the first computers, had the mainframes, had the server rooms, had some of the first computers in history, right? At universities, they're very closely guarded. Physical security. We knew the operator should be there. Everyone else, like GTFO, like you shouldn't be here. Now, technology is everywhere. The ports, to Tyler's point, right? USB ports, Ethernet ports, computers at the central workstation, at conference rooms that you can walk in, like I did in physical tests, walk around the front desk and go, oh, I'm here for a meeting. I'm just going to wait over there. And there's a conference room, and they've got all kinds of technology that I can interface with, right? So the landscape has changed that I think has made physical tests more important, whereas before you kind of knew my servers are on the 9th floor of this building in MIT, and that's where they are, and no one's allowed in there because only the operators can interface.
That's
right.
where the priests were, right?
The priests, exactly, Joff. Yes.
Yeah.
So we might be splitting hairs a little bit, but everything that Tyler just described, I used to do, during PCI assessments, because we would have to do a physical walk around of a data center back in the days where there were data centers that were actually at the customer sites, and primarily we were looking for all the doors had to be locked into the data center, in and out. There had to be camera coverage and like that. But I would all the time say, oh, by the way, especially when later on it was colo facilities. I'm like, all your servers are in a cage, but the cage is only 8 or 10 feet high.
Right,
Somebody could just prop a ladder up, and then we turn the corner and there'd be a ladder propped up. Like that type of thing. I mean, that was all just. I mean, that wasn't a physical security exercise. That was just value-added service.
No, Jeff, and I agree. There's tremendous value, and I see your point now, to a physical security audit versus a test, right?
Okay.
Like asking people, what's your process and procedures? Let's physically walk around, and then making recommendations saying, like, look, we don't have to go through the full, test of, sending someone in and doing this. Like, basically shore up these things. And then maybe later on when your maturity level is appropriate, maybe then we do a test. Jeff, I totally
it's
agree.
always a sliding scale.
And test, right? You audit and then test.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we were doing. So we were auditing. We do a walkthrough. We ask them what the procedure is, and they say we locked the server room door.
If they say we have no procedures, then
but I mean,
it's an opportunity.
But when they said they locked the server room door, I went down and see if it was locked.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean, and maybe it's just semantics, but I mean that was what we felt like was required. It wasn't.
So it's funny at the university when I worked at Brown University, we had I had to have a pen test from an external firm as part of project and audit, whatever, right? And they worked it was more of a purple team test, right? They worked with me as the security person, and they're like, we have to do physical testing. And they're like, we want to test the server room. And I'm like, good luck with that. I'm like seriously, guys, don't waste your time. The people that work there are very, very aware of security, and they have very, very clear defined policies. I'm really more concerned about what you can get to on our 144-acre campus, outside of that room. And he's like, so just for due diligence, went down there, jiggled a few knobs, kind of walked around, and he's like, someone looked at me and then came out and asked me, who are you and why should you be here? And he's like, I was done. Took me 10 minutes. You're cool. I'll spend the rest of my time figuring out maybe what improvements we can make in other areas, right? And that's an appropriate test, Jeff, to your point, right? You've got to model the test for your environment.
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying for me. I guess 99% of the time you can just walk somebody through and observe.
Sure.
What the things are. I mean, but even when it's a physical compromise and you're trying to point things out, I think it's important to talk about the objectives. What are the targets?
Yeah.
Because if you're just trying to do physical compromise, it doesn't need to be pen testers. Just hire some firm to just try to break in.
Absolutely. And our standard,
private detectors or something.
Our standard was an average person.
Chris had Nagy tell some great stories, and I think the things that Chris was talking about, where the organization has put a lot of time and effort into hiring the right people, creating the process and procedures, right? And they're hiring Chris's firm as an example to be like, all right, look, if you were to really do intelligence gathering, to be able to spoof caller ID, to be able to go through those lengths, how far would you get?
Right.
I think for some organizations, that's a really valuable exercise. And Chris tells great stories about, the wins are when he can go into an organization, try and get in, and just like push those people, and they just push back, and not push back so much in a creative sense, but push back and go, I was taught, and my procedures tell me, like, basically I'm not letting you in. And then Chris would try something else, and you can listen to the segment, right? And he's like, and I would try something else, and be like, yeah, like, still your story doesn't check out, like, you're not getting in. And Chris would try something else and beg and plead and then send someone else in and do OS in and try and spoof things, and they'd still be like, I'm not letting you in. Like, I'm following my process and procedures, and I'm just not letting you in. Like, there's no reason for me to do that. And I think those are really valid tests too, to make sure your stuff is working. Chris's recommendations on some of those tests that he talked about on the show was take that security guard who really understood your process procedures and what was at stake, and make that person the champion and have them train other people in the organization. To me, that's a win.
Yeah. One of the hard parts with orgs now for what we're doing for tests and when you do physicals is you're really trying to test the responses of all of the organizations and the blue team. It's really hard to do a full red team penetration test that's covert and only a few people know about it, especially across
someone knows
organizations.
About it.
Yeah. I've done pen tests for the last 8 years, and almost every one of our engagements have a pen test on Fortune 1 to 500. And the reason that most of them chose to do the physical side of that was because they would like to see how their staff reacted. What's their security awareness? How are their technological controls? And so you're not just there to test the actual piece. You have to have things done in order, and it's really hard to do that by doing a walkthrough. We've done lots of walkthroughs and see the value after the fact. But that doesn't always work when you're trying to test your blue team's defensive capabilities. And if no one knows about it, kind of how do you get that initial access? How do you do the phish? How do you emulate a sophisticated adversary appropriately? And you can often throw a physical on at the end and do an assumed breach or do phishing only. And those are appropriate means for some companies, but a lot of companies want to see what their actual emulated or risk profile is. Now,
Dr. Doug's on the show, and I want to transition the conversation to artificial intelligence, and we have two stories that I think play into this very nicely, or Joff as well, right? Or any of us, really, right? I think this is really kind of geeky, nerdy stuff that we like. And this headline called
geeky, nerdy stuff.
Now, what's interesting is a lot of times headlines catch my interest, and oftentimes I'm really disappointed, and I use it as an example of what not to write and a technique like not to have, or right. But this really kind of impressed me in terms of the headline was memes could be our secret weapon against pesky bots. Now, I was skeptical. I'm like, hold on. I appreciate a good meme just as much as the next person, right? But to me, this one has merit. So they propose memes could be one of the strongest techniques to distinguish between a human and a bot based on conscience and conscience, and interpretation. After all, bots don't get cultural references and online humor the way humans do. And when I read that, your minds are going, because some of you are Trekkies, right? Most of us are Trekkies, right? That I fondly remember Data, Star Trek Next Generation.
Anatomically correct.
Right? Atomically correct for you non-Trekkies out there trying to understand humor. There are many scenes in that television series where you can see Data really struggling to understand humor. And he was in the context of science fiction, the storyline really explored artificial intelligence in that character. And the one thing that they would come back to, those of us that watched the show, right, was we all thought it was funny, which is ironic, that the jokes were lost on poor Data, right? And so if you use that as a measure to determine whether it's a human or a machine, it's a valid test. Memes are one way to test that.
Maybe. I mean, the meme in the article was this little girl running with some kind of a thing in her hand, and some of us are icon challenged. I saw it, the title says "Coffee is ready," and I have no idea what this child was doing. My brain said, child possessed by demons plans to devour
Doug,
paper towel
I'd be lying if I got every reference in every meme, because some of them are very obscure.
No, I mean,
right?
I'm just being facetious.
Right. Yeah, no. But so you can't do one, right? You got to show a series.
I agree in reality that this is going to be something exceeding.
Has humor been explored in cultural references with respects to humor as a kind of like a Turing kind of test?
I don't know about a Turing test, but it's certainly been explored by psychologists and sociologists, and it varies wildly from culture to culture.
A way to differentiate human versus
But I mean,
machine.
what a German may find funny is very different from what a British person might find funny. But I mean,
but you're right. That presents a very interesting kind of cultural aspect to it, is that each culture has different forms. British humor, for example, very, very different
Dry
from American humor. Johnny and I were talking. Johnny's really into kung fu movies, and I've explored that genre through and through, right? And I've had to ask my friends who are Chinese, like, I don't get it. Like, explain not just the humor, but some of the differences in the way characters and storylines and cultural references are portrayed. It's just very, like, for example, humor aside, when we talk about a vampire or a zombie in U.S. culture, it's very different as to how that's portrayed in Chinese films, right? Very, very different.
Very different.
But similarities, but different enough that I think a computer would have a really tough time using that as a differentiator, given that cultural variable, right?
I mean, I guess it depends on how smart you think the AI is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Data was pretty smart.
Yeah,
and
our AI is nowhere near what is portrayed in the movies.
I mean, but like this thing with the coffee is ready. There was 4 options you could choose. I could argue that all 4 of them are correct, and I agree with you that an AI probably isn't going to initially understand a meme and get it, but I'm not totally convinced that humans will either, and I think it's going to be just like the It's
interesting. It's almost random what humans think is funny.
Right.
Like I could think something's funny and Doug wouldn't. How do you transfer that to?
How do you add that weighted value to that ML categorization? And
special?
I think all my jokes are funny, but I'm the only one that thinks that. So
I mean, hold on,
Jeff.
Yeah, and who's waiting?
We're talking a variation of false positive here.
Yeah.
And it's a hard nut to crack in this context, I think.
Mm.
I mean, you saw people arguing about the ones we have now, like saying, humans, not machine learning devices or anything,
right?
Saying, well, what constitutes a street sign? I mean, is it a street sign the state put up, or is it a sign that belongs to a store? And I mean, I've seen people arguing about those very things, and I could easily argue that every option on this picture is correct. I mean, the child could be running away from coffee. Maybe dad has been beating the family because, he drinks too much coffee or not enough coffee, and so she's running away because she heard dad was having coffee. She's scared of coffee because, the coffee was thrown on her by her crazed brother who's a psychopath. The child is holding coffee in this small plastic container. Well, it could be, and that's why she's screaming, because the plastic container is melting through her hand.
I'm having visions of the Whopper playing tic-tac-toe and just...
Exactly. Yeah. So a machine learning algorithm might actually learn how to deal with this. An AI could, depending on the person who programmed it. I don't know that this is the saving grace for a Turing test to distinguish between a botnet or whatever and a human, because I think the problem with memes is that they're too bizarre to start with.
They're left up to interpretation.
I mean, the memes that you post, we won't get into that.
Please don't.
A lot of people would find them incredibly offensive and, as a sense, might not get them.
It'd be interesting to develop a machine learning algorithm and have it score based on offensive versus funny versus not
Paul wins. Or Larry.
Well, here's the thing, right? And now, I know that Doug's a doctor and everything.
That's right, damn it.
But
he's dead, Jim.
He's dead, Jim. Frankly, I'm putting on the glasses here.
I'm not a doctor. I'm just a country programmer.
I'm a doctor, Jim, not a country programmer.
No, frankly, there are two variations of machine learning / artificial intelligence, and one is a statistical based model that is a classification system, right? You develop feature classifications. Mm-hmm. You have rules that you train the model. Basically, you're training the child, and you feed those rules into you feed a data set into those rules of various stimuli. Those data sets are either good or bad or otherwise, and then you train the model and you save it to disk. or whatever your storage mechanism is. And that model is ultimately something whereby it is a statistical representation that is calculated, probably random decision tree based, random decision forest based, and the model is saved to disk, and the decisions are going to be left right based on whether the following subsequent input is either good or bad based on the training data. Okay, that's one iteration here. This is what I would classify as machine learning. The second version that exists out there in the industry is more of the neural network based algorithms, which are truly more of an artificial intelligence. Those are things that companies are finding as they develop them and as they let them loose, that can be trained into being essentially bad children and running away into directions that they cannot predict, and they have to shut them down. Those are actually, frankly, more interesting to me.
In your first example, Joff, is that supervised machine learning in your first example and unsupervised in your second, or is the first one could be supervised or unsupervised? And
the first one certainly has to be supervised machine learning, because you have to actually give it data sets.
Give it data, right?
You have to tell it.
The correct
based
outcomes.
on this criteria that you have developed, maybe 4 or 5 features that you're classifying on. This is a good data set versus a bad data set, and they have to actually make statistical decisions and serialize that to disk or whatever the storage mechanism is.
And a neural network is more of the unsupervised nature.
Neural network is more of the unsupervised learning. So
but it still needs outcomes. The neural net still needs outcomes so you can train it.
The user still has to provide the outcomes.
You still have to have a way to weight those neural net decisions, because as the neural net learns, it has to still weight its decisions internally on the hidden layers. So you don't know necessarily how those weights develop, but there has to be sort of a starting point and an ending point, and the neural net finds a path to those places.
Yeah, exactly. Neural net is something that is more akin to the human brain, because it does evolve as it iterates, and it is definitely an iterable kind of process, whereas the machine learning approach with these large-scale statistical and they basically linear algebra kind of approaches, that they are purely classification-based, and they are purely algebraic calculations that are being applied to an existing trained model. So,
Jeff,
So I have a question. Understanding that this is just one possible application of AI, and this whole idea of discovering bots versus real people. My question to anyone is there a difference between trying to find the bot versus trying to find the human? And the only analogy I can think of is maybe in the early days of firewalls. Is it the default allow or the default deny type of approach?
That's a great question.
Jeff, it's a good question, because that's exactly where I was angling my background at. If you look at the machine learning approach, the outcome of that model that you train is only as good as the various inputs that you train it against. And you can certainly characterize different children if you like. You can have, a child that's more biased towards looking for certain characteristics versus a child that's, sort of more biased to looking for other characteristics. But I guess it really depends on your goal when you're training the model.
So what I hear Joff saying is that you could have a model that is more looking for the computer and a model that's more looking for the human, and then maybe combine those to help make the decision.
Right. And there's going to be no perfect approach.
Right. Understanding it's not a perfect approach, and I'm struggling to try to find the right way to ask the question, but it's kind of like, it's really, really hard to detect if something is a human because of all the variables. But is there a slightly easier problem to solve by, coming up with, a conclusion, I guess, if that's the right term, of, well, I can't tell if it's human, but it's definitely not a bot.
Yeah, but there's a difference between the artificial intelligence that is, trying to play chess, like we know that there's a human playing chess against a computer, right? Isn't the foundations of AI was basically early computers that were like artificial intelligence was we're going to teach a computer to play chess. The artificial intelligence or machine learning that's applied to differentiating between the two is almost a different science than trying to pit a computer against a human.
But everybody's omitting an assumption. And the assumption is, what is it you're trying to achieve? So if the device was supposed to behave like a human, which I think is a very foolish and naive thing, and we've tried to program something to act like a human, then it's tough to say what Jeff's question's outcome might be, because like Eliza. So Eliza is a good example. That it was an early effort at a sort of machine learning kind of thing, but it wasn't that. It was not even learning. It was just supposed to emulate humans and fool the Turing test. So there's a difference between.
So differentiate the Turing test from the Voight-Kampff test for us.
Well, a Turing test was based on a parlor game that was essentially trying to distinguish by asking questions to people that were hidden behind a screen. So you were supposed to pick.
And this was part of Alan Turing's research?
It is Alan Turing stuff,
Turing based.
They didn't just base it on.
Well, Turing was doing a thought exercise, and he was saying, if a machine could behave like humans, and he used this parlor game that people played in the 19th century.
He was doing this in
the 30s. So in the 19th century, there was a parlor game where three people sat behind a screen, and there were different variants of it where one was like trying to figure out who the female was, or who the lawyer was, or something like that. So
this goes back even.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So the interrogator, who was the person who actually knew what was going on, wrote. He asked questions, and then the people wrote their responses, and he read them back to the person playing the game. So I write a question, and I say, "What do you think of coffee?" And each person writes a response, and if the objective is to try to guess who the woman in the group is, or who the person who's a cook is, or whatever, then the interrogator reads the answers back to the person playing, and that person tries to guess who it is. So Turing was saying, if you could take a machine and put it in that group, and the interrogator
could you differentiate humans from machines.
Yeah. So the true sort of fallacy, and then Turing would agree with this, I think. The true fact, he was never trying to do this sci-fi thing of proving something with the Voight-Kampff problem.
Right.
He was
a computer scientist.
Absolutely.
One of the first.
He would even say that, look, what you could program a computer to emulate a human, but that's not intelligence.
No.
And that's what Eliza was. It was an attempt and Whimsy was the first thing that got close to being. It was a program called Whimsy, and it just interjected random things almost in an attempt to fool the person playing, because they're thinking, well, a computer would always respond the same way. So if I say, do you like dogs? A computer will always say yes or no, but a human might go, well, sometimes. So program the thing so that it gives you some weird answer. And Whimsy would say stuff like, dogs are cool, but what about roses? And it fooled people all the time, because they're going, well, a computer would never say something so strange and obtuse as that. And so there's a huge assumption here about what we're trying to test.
And so is that where Turing came up with the Turing test to differentiate between those
and
answers?
so he was just sort of it was a thought exercise for him about how a machine might fit into this, and it was never intended to be a Voight-Kampff test, which was, of course, attempting to distinguish where the replicants were and who were the humans.
And is that a total sci-fi thing, or is
it was a total sci-fi thing? It was completely made up.
Yep.
But basically, the Turing test was never intended by him, I don't think, to be some kind of defining factor
between human and machine.
But we adapted it later to try to, and it's become this awful meme of, if something passed the Turing test, it must be a human. But it's not. And would you even want to program a machine to be like a human? So it's like whimsical, and some of them become psychopathic, and that's how you get Skynet.
But the reason we're talking about Voight-Kampff and all of that is because Blade Runner, as many of us know, listening to the show, we're nerds, huge Blade Runner fans.
Yes.
You've got the T-shirt on, Doug. And it's set in November of 2019.
Yeah. And so,
which is where we are today.
I mean, so I remember having this experience back in 1984. But go on.
Well, Philip K.
Yeah.
Dick wrote the original story, which has nothing to do with the movie, mind you, other than in a very vague way, back in the 60s. And he was sort of exploring the idea that could machines start to fulfill components of our lives that were being unfulfilled by humans, and could those machines start to replace humans as important components of our lives?
It's amazing that when we look at today, we carry smartphones and have all this technology. It's amazing to me, listening to Stephen Levy's book, right, that folks were thinking about this stuff in the 50s. And then if you look even further back, like people were thinking about this even long before that. And so much so that in the book, in the 50s and 60s at MIT, there was professors and classes on artificial intelligence.
And people
I think that's
were
lost on many
people
of the...
were very worried about this stuff.
Point of clarification, Alan Turing actually published that paper on the Turing test in the 50s. I think you mentioned earlier it was like 30s, it was actually in the 50s.
Some of his seminal works were like 33 and 34, and then that paper about the Turing test was later, so it was
the actual summary paper.
That was basically the birth.
But like the machine learning paper, the famous machine learning paper, was like 1939 or something. I mean, it was crazy.
Okay. So it goes way back. All right.
Yeah,
so let's talk about Blade Runner, because there's like friggin' ridiculous articles that state things like this. The article that I read, one of them, was, and we don't need the Voight-Kampff test yet, which I debate, but how many times have you been asked to mark all the traffic lights on a grid picture to prove you're not a robot and gain access to a website?
Yeah.
And can you do it?
I don't know. I think we're kind of way off the rails on comparing this to a Turing test. And
absolutely.
Right?
I think it's important to point out something, though, that I don't think I made quite clear. And I'm backtracking a little bit. But from a fascination perspective, the neural network algorithms are much more interesting from a self-determination and learning perspective than the traditional machine learning statistical approach.
Yeah.
Supervised learning is just that. It's going to have specific classification criteria. It's going to generate a specific statistical score based on the input from the model that has been derived. And while it can be dynamically updated, it still is going to have a point-in-time score that will be a conclusion. Neural network, on the other hand, is potentially going to continuously evolve, and depending on how it's programmed, I think that is a much more fascinating topic, and I think that's as computing resources continue to explode exponentially, I think the neural network space is going to get really, really interesting.
But if you ever want to gauge as to where we are with this, try to have a conversation with your voice assistants.
You can. Right.
Yeah, we're not quite there yet, right?
Maybe that's because they're trying to emulate humans and try to have a conversation with another human.
I'll tell you exactly why it is. I think, and Google can argue with me about this, but I'm guessing I'm going to be right, or they won't admit it, is that the systems that work are going to be primarily supervised learning systems now.
Yes.
But
that's where it's at.
There's two different things here, and this is back to Blade Runner in some ways. There is an artificial intelligence that is designed to interact with humans. So that's what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. So that's a system that had to be supervised learning. It had to be trained in human.
Because it had to understand humans.
It has to understand humans. But then there's the Voight-Kampff problem. So the replicants in Blade Runner were beyond humans. They didn't react the way humans did to anything. And Voight-Kampff was more like a lie detector test than a Turing test. They were looking at the replicants' responses to empathy situations and things like that, and trying to measure their responses, because humans responded differently to these scenarios inherently, like a lie detector. So that's what they were measuring. That's why they were measuring their retinal response and their blood pressure and all these kind of things to see if they responded differently to empathy situations than humans. So a sociopath might not have passed a Voight-Kampff test. So Same thing with the replicants.
Yeah.
So the replicants were essentially sociopaths. They had no empathy for humans. They were designed to do a specific task, and they were somewhere off in left field because nobody cared if they interacted with humans. They were designed to be military. Skynet's the same example. Skynet was not designed to understand humans. It was going to squash them like bugs if it needed to.
But there are, in science fiction, which is totally based on this conversation alone, right? And then if you go back and start reading the research, if you look at Star Wars, totally just built, like arbitrarily built feelings in. You hear C-3PO in the movies go,
right.
I have a bad feeling about this. And you're like, wait, hold on.
But he was programmed to say that.
You were programmed to say that.
He was a supervised learning device that was designed to interact with humans. So the difference in C-3PO and Roy Batty is Roy Batty was designed to be a robot soldier. Mm-hmm. You don't need to impose human values on a robot soldier who's fighting an alien war.
Right.
You create a device that learns to solve the problem in any way imaginable. If that means whatever, scorched earth doesn't make any difference because that's the reason you had a robot soldier. C-3PO's got to interact with humans and help them.
But it's why robots make the best bounty hunters.
Of course, because
I don't
want
to spoil anything about what's out there in the Star Wars canon,
Roy Batty, if the guy he's trying to catch or destroy is holding up a baby and saying, I'll kill the baby, Roy Batty just shoots them both and says, problem solved, end of story. Right. Whereas C-3PO spends 4 hours trying to debate the issue with the guy and tries to talk him down.
My kids ask the best questions. My middle son asked me, he's like, how many different languages does C-3PO speak? Like, I love this question. He's fluent in over 400 forms of communication.
Exactly.
Right?
Not all of them are languages.
I didn't hesitate to answer it. He was like, wow.
How do you love this question? C-3PO is a completely fictional character made out of fucking George Lucas's weird-ass dreams, man. Come on.
It comes from Philip Campbell and Akira Kurosawa.
Yeah, I know. I'm just kidding. I think I love the question as well. It's good to dream.
But I think that has shaped some of our views and opinions on what we're talking about today as artificial intelligence and machine learning. We need to bring people down to reality and separate science fiction from reality. And even though much of what we're discussing today, some of which was born from papers in the 1930s, first of all, amazing, but speaks to also when we look at all of the data in front of us, right, pun intended, that we're not quite there. Like there is a finite state of where we are, and I think that the nerd in all of us watching all the science fiction movies hopes that it continues to improve. But I also, on the flip side, think that's important to push the envelope of this technology. And certainly, we've seen in security, to bring it back to security, a lot of advances as to how this technology can help us as humans make decisions today. Right?
Yep. We're in the crawl phase.
Agreed.
Is where we're at.
And in the past 50 years, we're still in the crawl phase, right?
Yeah. No, it's totally true, right? We're applying classification systems and building models and doing a pretty reasonable job at it, but these systems cannot think for themselves yet. We have a lot of ethical questions around that. For those who are experimenting in neural networks, they already know that some of those algorithms are getting out of control and becoming unpredictable. And the default response right now in the neural network world is just to shut them down.
If you really want to explore this topic in film, I think Ex Machina really pushes the envelope.
Yeah.
And is a really cool ride if you really want to like just take a lot of the facts off the table and just kind of dream and extrapolate what this
read
would be.
iRobot.
iRobot. So that was a book before
Asimov wrote this book again in the 50s, I think. And he was exploring this very idea.
Is that what the movie's based on?
Vaguely, yeah.
Vaguely.
But I mean,
yeah.
But Asimov was writing this thing about this robot who commits a murder, and he had these 3 rules of robotics, and they had developed this thing called the positronic brain, which was he was basically describing machine learning.
Right.
That was something that could exceed human capability that we couldn't understand. So he had these hard-coded rules had been put into the robot's brain to try to prevent Skynet.
Yeah.
So he was trying to prevent Blade Runner from happening because he said the engineers were worried.
Blade Runner and Terminator before those storylines were even written.
Yeah.
Even written, right?
Oh, long before.
Long before.
I mean, but this is one of the best security books if we're talking about sci-fi in terms of security, because if you think about that, it was about how do you write secure code when you think the code is going to evolve beyond your control. How do you put constraints around code that you're going to turn loose in the wild and say, I don't know what it's going to do?
Now, see, I think we're a long way from that because I just have problems debugging my own code, let alone worrying about that it's going to create a mind of its own, right?
I don't know that we're that far from it.
I don't
actually,
either.
Paul. I would disagree. I think there's some very large entities, Google being one of them, probably Amazon being another. That
Well, and
are turning
IBM
loose
Watson
code.
certainly has models that are
Well,
far advanced, or is that-
we're standing somewhere along this canyon where somebody's going to come up with a way to do this, and it's not going to be that far in the future. And it's going to be one of those. It's going to be one of those big light bulbs that goes on, and when it does, it's going to be absolutely terrifying because when somebody figures out, oh, all I really need to do is this, and all of a sudden you got code that's smarter than you, that can write itself and that can write new code and develop new algorithms that we are not capable of understanding because
we're all
not
living
smart enough.
in 25 versions.
Suddenly we turn into it is Skynet.
25 versions of the
suddenly-
Matrix, basically.
Yeah, well, it's Skynet sitting out there saying, "I'm going to make the decision for what's best for humanity."
Well, and you look at it, something I said on the last show is the control plane. The control plane is software now.
Yep.
All right, think about that. The control plane is software, and if we have potentially artificial intelligent algorithms that can be written that can exert control over the control plane, then you can envision a future whereby those algorithms will exert that control without us directing them, assuming, and that's a bit of a stretch, but assuming that the algorithm has been turned loose into a self-learning kind of mode. And furthermore, the concentration of compute power is now sufficient to make that scalable at a level that should frighten us.
And then there's an ethics piece of, do we limit something that has the potential to grow beyond us? And it gets really scary, and that's why I felt so much sadness when I saw the sex robots, because I felt sorry for them.
Well, and when you watch... hold on. But when you watched Age of Ultron, too.
Yeah.
There's only one trump card.
That's that
is
storyline,
electricity.
basically.
So if you can turn off the electricity, you terminate all of it. But if the control plane of the electrical grid is within the algorithm's control, then we're done.
That's
we're
Skynet. Skynet says, sorry, I'm out. No, you're not going to do that. Thank you very much.
That was like one of the nerdiest conversations we've ever had.
Yes.
I think we should probably wrap up.
I agree. I don't think we can top that, Joff, right? Well, I want to thank everyone for listening and watching this edition of Paul Security Weekly. Joff, take us out.
All right. Over and out. Have happy dreams, everybody, about Skynet.